On the morning of April 12, 1938, a crowd of thousands gathered at Grand Central Terminal in New York. They hadn't come to meet a train. They had come to watch a man being taken away in handcuffs under guard. A man the whole country had called the savior of Wall Street not so long ago. Richard Whitney, former president of the New York Stock Exchange, broker to the Morgan family, a graduate of Groton and Harvard, a schoolmate of Franklin Roosevelt, a man with a spotless reputation, trusted by the entire financial elite of the country. That day, he was being taken to Sing Sing prison to serve his sentence. But the most incredible part wasn't the theft itself, it was what he chose to steal. The New York Stock Exchange kept a special fund to help the families of deceased brokers. It paid out money to the widows and children of men who had spent their whole lives working on that exchange. One of the trustees of that fund was Richard Whitney himself, and that is exactly where he took about $1 million from. And that was far from the only episode. For more than 10 years, Whitney lived on other people's money. He robbed his friends, his clients, his own family, and even the club whose treasurer he happened to be. And the entire time, he remained one of the most respected men in American finance. But how? How did a man watched by thousands of eyes deceive the financial elite of an entire country for a full decade, without anyone suspecting a thing? To understand that, we need to go back 9 years, to the day Richard Whitney became a national hero. October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. Panic sweeps through Wall Street. Share prices are plunging. Brokers are shouting over one another, and the visitors up in the gallery watch in horror as entire fortunes vanish in a matter of minutes. At that very moment, behind closed doors in the J.P. Morgan building, the heads of America's largest banks are gathering. They understand one thing. Money alone will not stop this panic. The market needs a man it will believe, and their choice falls on Richard Whitney. That choice was no accident. At the time, Whitney was vice president of the stock exchange and the chief bond broker for the Morgan Bank. His older brother George was a partner at that same bank. Behind him stood the family name, the estate in Far Hills, the thoroughbred racehorses, the fox hunting, and membership in clubs that money alone could not buy you into. In that world, reputation counted for more than any document, and the right family opened any door. If a man like that is buying, he must know something. That same day, Whitney walks calmly across the trading floor in his impeccable black suit. He stops at the post where U.S. Steel is traded, and loudly, so that everyone can hear, he names his price, $205 a share, well above what the market is trading at right then. Then he moves on through the floor and places the same kind of demonstrative orders on other blue chips. The whole thing was staged for the audience, and it worked. The shouting on the floor died down. The market exhaled. The Dow Jones closed just 6.38 points lower. Later, it would become clear that this was only a brief pause before a far deeper collapse. But on that day, America needed a hero, and it got one. The next morning, the newspapers called Whitney the White Knight of Wall Street, and a few months later, in early 1930, he was elected president of the New York Stock Exchange, the youngest in its history. America had its hero, but no one knew yet that this White Knight had a secret. The man who had just saved the exchange was himself buried in debt and living on money that wasn't his. What the public didn't know yet was that the brilliant financier Richard Whitney was a remarkably terrible investor. He had a weakness you don't expect in an aristocrat, a hunger to get rich fast. He loved risky bets, lottery ticket stocks that were supposedly going to make a fortune overnight, and he borrowed money to play them. His pattern never changed. He'd put money into some questionable venture. He'd lose it. He'd borrow from his brother or from friends. And instead of stopping, he'd double the bet, which meant doubling the losses still to come. Today, you'd call a man like that a gambling addict. Only he wasn't gambling in a casino. He was gambling on the exchange he himself was president of. The first venture like that came back in the 1920s. Whitney put money into a company that mined peat in Florida and sold it as fertilizer. Think about that. The chief broker for the Morgan Bank, a man with the financial statements of all of Wall Street sitting on his desk, putting his own money into swamp dirt. The company went under. Whitney borrowed from his brother George and put the money into the next venture, trying to win it back. Then again, and again. By 1931, he owed at least $2 million. And now remember what kind of time this was. 1931 is the very bottom of the Great Depression. A quarter of the country out of work. In the cities, the lines of the unemployed stretch for blocks. People are selling anything they can just to keep from starving. And Richard Whitney, meanwhile, changes nothing about the way he lives. Not the horses, not the estate, not the servants, not the clubs. The president of the exchange can't afford to look poor. The whole legend of the man without a flaw would come down with it. Let him sell so much as one horse, and the word goes around Wall Street. And a rumor, for him, is more dangerous than the debt. And this is where it turns truly dark. Because a man who can't stop and can't afford to look poor, sooner or later comes to a line. Whitney came to it, and then he crossed it. When there was no one left to borrow from, he started to steal. He began with the money closest to hand. Whitney wasn't only the president of the exchange. He held honorary positions at the most prestigious clubs in New York. And one of those positions came with access to other people's money. He was treasurer of the New York Yacht Club, one of the most exclusive institutions in the country. A treasurer controls the club's bonds and its funds. And Whitney began quietly taking those bonds and pledging them against personal loans. The logic of a man in a position of trust is simple, and it's despicable. You've been trusted to safeguard what belongs to someone else. You take it, you pledge it, you get the cash, and you promise yourself you'll put it back before anyone notices. And then you don't put it back because the new debts eat everything. And it kept going. He borrowed from acquaintances on Wall Street. The amounts varied. $15,000 from one man, $100,000 from another. He pledged his own wife's securities. He even mortgaged his estate in Far Hills. And here is the answer to the central question of this whole story. Why did no one suspect a thing? Because there was no one to check. The New York Stock Exchange demanded accounting from the entire country, but answered to no one itself. Government oversight didn't exist, and the one man who should have been checked first was running the exchange. The biggest black hole of all was his own company, Distilled Liquors Corporation, which made apple brandy. Whitney expected to make a fortune once Prohibition was repealed, but sales collapsed because the product was awful. So he started propping up the price of its stock artificially. With money borrowed from other people, he bought up his own shares, creating the illusion of strong demand. As long as the price held, those shares could be pledged for still more loans. In effect, he was holding up their value with other people's money, and then using that inflated value to take out new loans. It was a pyramid with exactly one investor in it, himself. He was a man sinking in a swamp, but the very bottom was still ahead of him. The New York Stock Exchange had a special fund, the Gratuity Fund. When a member of the exchange died, his family received a payment from it. That money had been set aside over decades for the widows and children left without a provider. Richard Whitney got to that money too. As one of the trustees of the fund, he had access to its bonds, and he pledged them to raise new cash. In all, about $1 million vanished from the fund. That was probably the darkest line he ever crossed. While Whitney was publicly assuring America that Wall Street was a community of gentlemen, a place where reputation mattered more than money, he was spending the money of widows and orphans on his own debts, his lavish life, and his attempts to save a failing business. By this point, his financial pyramid had grown enormous. According to investigators, over the years he took in and churned through more than $30 million of other people's money. New loans went to pay off old ones, and every attempt to delay the collapse only made the eventual losses bigger. This went on for more than 10 years. And it wasn't only about Whitney himself. He belonged to a circle of people everyone was used to trusting. Nobody asked unnecessary questions here, and problems were handled quietly, without letting them out past the walls of the exchange. Wall Street's reputation was guarded just as carefully as its money. After the crash of 1929, America demanded that order be brought to Wall Street. In 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created, the SEC. For the first time, the government had the right to inspect what had always been considered Wall Street's own private business. The irony was that this was the very oversight Richard Whitney had been arguing against in Washington, in front of senators, not long before. In 1935, he stepped down as president of the exchange, but his firm remained a member. And in March 1938, the exchange required all of its member firms to submit financial statements. This time, there was no getting around the inspection. Whitney tried to buy himself time and submitted documents with made-up numbers. So the auditors came to his office. Step by step, they put the whole picture back together. The pledged bonds from the relief fund, the missing client securities, the debts, the fake transactions, and the enormous hole Whitney had spent years trying to fill with new loans. The verdict was obvious. The firm of Richard Whitney and Company was insolvent. Whitney made one last attempt to save himself. For all those years, Richard had been bailed out by his older brother George, a partner at J.P. Morgan. More than once, George had covered his debts, saving not just his brother but the family name. But now, hundreds of thousands of dollars were needed, and even George couldn't solve that. So Whitney went to one of the partners at the Morgan Bank. For the first time in his life, he told the whole truth about the money from the relief fund, about the pledged securities, about the debts and the forgeries. And then he asked for another $280,000, hoping to put off the collapse one last time. He still believed that belonging to the right circle would open any door. But this time, the door didn't open. He was turned down. On March 8, 1938, the gong sounded on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The gong on the exchange normally rings at the start or the end of the trading day, but that day, it was struck in the middle of trading. The president of the exchange, Charles Gay, stepped up to the rostrum and read out a short statement. The firm of Richard Whitney and Company could not meet its obligations. It was suspended from trading, effective immediately. To most of the brokers, it sounded like an ordinary bankruptcy, but it soon became clear that something far more serious was hidden behind that financial collapse. That same day, the exchange announced that Richard Whitney's conduct was contrary to just and equitable principles of trade. And a few days later, the Board of Governors made a decision that would have been unthinkable not long before. The former president of the New York Stock Exchange was formally expelled from its membership for conduct unbecoming a member. The news went around the country in an instant. Newspapers that had recently called Whitney the White Knight of Wall Street were now writing about years of theft. But the most telling reaction of all came from one particular man, the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had attended the same school, Groton, as Whitney. They came from the same circle, and when Roosevelt was brought the news, he said just a few words, almost like a child. "Not Dick Whitney. I can't believe it." The embezzlement charges were brought by New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey. The evidence was such that there was nothing left to defend. Whitney pleaded guilty. The sentence? 5 to 10 years, Sing Sing prison. A month later, on April 12, 1938, Richard Whitney was brought under guard to Grand Central Terminal in New York. A crowd was already waiting on the platform. People were standing up on the benches to get a better look at the former president of the New York Stock Exchange. And Whitney, a man who had spent his whole life carefully guarding his reputation, walked in silence with his briefcase held up over his face. That was the moment Richard Whitney stopped existing as a public figure. After that, everything was sold off to cover the debts: the mansion in Manhattan, the estate in New Jersey, the horses, the property. He was barred from the securities business for life. And then his personal belongings went up for auction too. A stem-wind watch, pearl cufflinks, his clothes. Everything that was left of a man who not long before had been handling millions. Richard Whitney's story ended far more quietly than it began. In prison, he was considered a model inmate, and in August 1941, he was released on parole, having served 3 years and 4 months. The former president of the New York Stock Exchange took a job managing a dairy farm. He had 3 workers and 25 cows under him. His older brother George, to save the family's honor, kept his promise and paid off every one of Richard's debts, down to the last dollar. Whitney himself lived another 30-plus years and died in 1974 at the age of 86. He never set foot on Wall Street again. Richard Whitney was a man everyone trusted. The Morgan Bank, the President of the United States, the entire financial elite of America. And that turned out not to be enough, because trust should never take the place of oversight. So, friends, if you had been living in America in the 1930s, would you have suspected Richard Whitney? Or would you have trusted a man with a reputation like that too?